Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're joined by Kevin Page. Mr. Page is an authority on the country's finances, having served in the federal public service for 27 years, culminating with a 5-year run as Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer. He was the first ever in that position. While there, he provided independent analysis on the state of the country's books and trends in the national economy. From there, he went on to become the founding president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, where he currently works on all things finance and public policy. Kevin, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
A pleasure, Mitch. Thank you.
Yeah, so really appreciate you being on, and we've got a lot of talk about COVID-19 related, so let's get to it. Given your experience at the Parliamentary Budget Office and the work you're currently doing, really one of the top authorities in the country on speaking about the federal government's fiscal position. And I want to talk about that and start there, because recently we've seen the current Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux, come out and say that the deficit is likely to be higher than the $252 billion that he estimated in April, and that the federal debt could reach as much as $1 trillion quite soon. And these were numbers we weren't talking about 2 or 3 months ago. So I just want to get, as we start this conversation, your initial thoughts on those projections, those numbers, and when should we start worrying about the level of spending?
Yeah, so those are startling numbers for sure, Mitch. Just in historic terms, for Canadians, we've not seen numbers like that. And if you and I were having a conversation a year ago, and just prior to a pandemic, no one was thinking about the possibility of numbers that are anywhere of this in this sort of ballpark. So yeah, deficit. I mean, I think again, I sort of start with the situation has evolved quickly, I think, over the past number of weeks. And I think economists have really struggled to kind of keep up with changes. And, some of those changes really are, I think, are driven from the public health side, and, the lockdown of the economy to provide this, containment of this virus. So I think economists have struggled to kind of fully appreciate how significant the lockdown was. So we've seen like these downward adjustments to forecasts, almost, starting in February. And I think so we now have a forecast that, I think that people are using it from the Parliamentary Budget Officer that really talks about like a decline on an annual average basis of 12% for 2020. And that's 3-4 times deeper than anything we've ever seen before, including like the 2008-9 global financial crisis. So it's just like, again, we've shut down the economy. This is an enormous decline. And this will obviously, take away a lot of revenues. And, then the government's provided enormous fiscal supports because of the shrinkage in the economy. And so, we're sitting on a deficit of about $250 billion. And I think in terms of our projection for 2020-21, and about 150 of that probably is related to just direct fiscal contribution supports for households, for businesses, and some sectors. And then, and just the revenue loss. We'll see a decline in year-over-year revenues, $50-60 billion just in level terms. So, it's just like it's an enormous change on historic times. And then when you kind of put this in a debt context, going into the start of this year, federal debt, and there's different ways to measure debt, but it was if you look at federal debt, starting with gross liabilities, and you take away financial and non-financial assets, you get something called like the accumulated deficit. It was sitting about a little over $700 billion, maybe $750 billion. So now you start adding numbers like $250 billion to it. So you're getting close to $1 trillion, as a percentage of GDP. Again, that debt would probably be in the 50% range, which is a number that we haven't seen for a couple of decades. And, and again, that $250 billion deficit, and as a percentage of GDP, would be something like 13%. And in my lifetime, the highest we saw was, I think, 8% in the early 80s. So yeah, we're definitely in uncharted waters. And again, all of this really is triggered by this sort of global pandemic and Canada's health response. And it's just an incredible evolution of these numbers.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a couple of things I want to build off on that, but one is that you use the real GDP forecast of negative 12%, and I'm glad you did, because I wanted to ask you about that specifically. So when the crisis sort of started out, we saw some private sector economic forecasts and even some public sector ones. I mean, I think the Ontario government's fiscal update said a 0% growth for the year and didn't project negative. Now we've completely blown past that. The consensus is this negative 12% GDP. But as this drags on, we're starting to see those rosy, optimistic Q3 and Q4 rebound numbers probably come into some question about whether or not we're going to actually recover. So do you think that negative 12% GDP growth for 2020 is the right figure, or do you think it's actually too optimistic?
I think in this environment, Mitch, I think we need to think in terms of scenarios, and finance will need to kind of have a baseline type of forecast, and then they can prepare scenarios around it. I'm hoping, this is maybe a little naive on my part, that annual average of minus 12% is kind of an outer bound in terms of the depth of this recession. Like, again, when you break it out into the quarter by quarter, PBO has built in a massive 20% quarter to quarter drop in GDP, real GDP in the second quarter. And then you're right. Yeah. And then we have some bounce backs based on that, that significant drop. But again, if you kind of look at it in level terms, we're still, if you were to project out through 2021, we're still going to be, it could take us a year and a half easily to get back to, the levels that we saw at the end of 2019 in terms of real GDP. So like it is a bounce back. Those numbers look rosy, but it's based on the fact that, it's this bounce. And the bounce is a very deep drop that the PBO has included in 2000 and in the second quarter of this year, 2020. And so if you compare the PBO forecast with other outlooks, either by the private sector in Canada or the IMF, as an example, Mitch, is assuming an annual average decline of about 6%, and this was as part of their April update. So PBO is kind of, again, they pushed the boundary in terms of the decline. If you look at what, say, is being projected for European countries or in the United States, they're kind of in that 6, 7, 8% range. So like I'm hoping that Canada's experience won't be that far different than others. But you're right, these forecast numbers are moving. And like here we are today, and we're getting towards the end of May, and we're seeing across the country the economy starting to open up. Like if we have some breaks with respect to, if we can continue to maintain this relatively lower transmission of this virus and the economy continues to open up, I think like maybe we don't even get as much as a 12% decline in GDP. And maybe, again, there's still a lot of, issues around the size of that deficit. Maybe we could do a little bit better than $250 billion. I'm hoping.
Yeah. I think optimism is a needed thing right now, so I'll take it. Yeah, I think that's a good point, that hopefully the 12% is the outer limits, because that economic activity, as a personal anecdote, I had a friend who said, aside from rent and groceries, he spent $40 last month. And so just the economic activity that people should be generating themselves just in their normal course of habit, be it, grabbing a bite to eat, buying a case of beer, playing golf, those sorts of things, whatever it might be that they were spending on. It's nice to think that maybe we'll start to see some of that come back with these loosening restrictions. But before we turn to sort of the recovery, I do want to ask a couple more questions about the debt to GDP ratio as a sign for that optimism that you spoke about. So that's projected to be around 48%, but still well below the country's peak of almost 67% in 1995-96. So of course, there's still provincial debt loads to think about. There's still large municipal operating deficits that have to be dealt with too. But is that federal debt to GDP ratio really the best metric to evaluate the spending room that we have? Or should we be a little bit more worried or using a different metric than that would be letting us to believe?
I think, these sort of comparing various measures of debt, could be gross debt, total liabilities, or net debt when you take away financial assets, or federal debt, the way you've been talking about, like the 48-50% numbers that we're seeing now, which is total liabilities less financial non-financial debt. Like there are a lot of measures of debt, and I think it's pretty common for bond rating agencies, international organizations that are doing comparisons to look at these different measures of debt, and usually deflated by income. And so Like, yeah, for Canada to see, to go from something like the low 30s to about 50% in 1 year is like, just by on the surface of it, on the sheer face of it, is like an enormous jump. And for somebody like me who worked at finance and central agencies through the 80s and 90s, it seems like, well, we're really turning the clocks back, and so much hard work went to generate those surpluses or balanced budgets in the late 90s, early 2000s, federally and provincially, that it's a big step backwards. And yeah, I think there's a sense that we will lose some fiscal room, just on the sheer movement of that number. But yeah, and so then when you kind of dig deeper underneath that number, that 50% debt to GDP ratio number, and you compare it, say, as the bond rating agencies will be, like, how does that compare for a national government with European countries of the United States? And like, you can go to the International Monetary Fund, their fiscal monitor, and you'd see that Canada is like, will still be less than half of these sort of debt to GDP ratios that they look at, of an average of advanced economies, and more than much less than half than, say, even the United States, or our major trading partner. So like, historically, we're a big step backwards. Comparatively, it's all, like Einstein said, it's all relative. On a relative basis, we still look okay. Then you go a little bit deeper and you look at like, what is the carrying cost of this debt? And so and the fiscal people will look at the debt interest costs relative to revenues that they take in, and again, because we're very close to zero interest rates right now, even though we're adding enormous amounts of debt. Like, they actually changed that, the visa bill, the interest bill, not going to change that much, even in nominal terms, and it's at record lows in my lifetime. And so, like, when I was at the Department of Finance through the 80s and early 90s. And I spent time in the fiscal policy division at finance, like in late 80s, early 90s. Like, it was common to be like, for every revenue dollar we took in, it was like we were spending more than 30 cents on debt interest costs, so the public debt interest charges. And so right now, it's down to less than 10 cents. So it was a really important indicator back when Canada was under some fiscal stress, and there were bond rating agencies saying maybe we're not AAA in the early 90s. They were very concerned about the carrying costs. So our carrying costs are very low in historic terms, and actually even low relative to other countries. So yeah, it's a big jump upwards, and again, so people are asking. There's newspaper reports coming out more frequently now, like, could this change our AAA bond rating status? And I hope it doesn't. I think the government would be very mindful of not wanting to lose that. So when they start to think about policy going forward, how do we unwind these measures, the fiscal supports, that they would be very mindful. They don't want to lose that AAA status.
Mm-hmm. So I know that you've publicly made some calls for some sort of fiscal update or fiscal transparency from the government, given everything that's going on. And I think the more that you speak to what these different debt loads look like, the different measures of them, it would be great to not only get a clear picture of where we're at right now, but also a projection from where the government itself sees this going. But I do want to kind of transfer the conversation from a little bit less about where we're at right now and where we've managed to go over the past couple of months to where we might be going in the future as, again, we hopefully get into a true recovery and out of this pandemic. So there's been a lot of doom and gloom so far in the conversation. So if we're turning to the recovery side of things, I just want to start to set the table with the work that you're doing at IFSD. You've joined with some other groups like Canada 2020 to launch something called the Recovery Project. Just for our listeners, can you quickly tell us what that is all about?
Sure, Mitch. I think there's we're working with Canada 2020, like a very progressive think tank in Canada, well known, run out of Ottawa, led by a fellow named Tim Barber. We joined up with an international organization, Global Progress, based in Washington, D.C., led by a well-known analyst, Matt Brown. And the purpose really is just start engaging all kinds of people, very much like the way you're doing it, Mitch, to talk to different people about where we're at now and how do we start opening up the economy, and what kind of economy are we going to have post COVID-19 pandemic, and what kind of policy debates do we need to have. So, and that kind of conversation cuts across the full policy spectrum, from public health issues to economic and fiscal policy, social policy, tax policy, et cetera. Yeah, so it's really just to bring voices together.
So as you do that work and collect those voices to figure out sort of the path out of this and the long-term impacts of the COVID-19 recession, I'm wondering what you think are some of the key challenges and questions that we'll need to ask ourselves and ultimately to answer. I've been hearing a few that I think are relevant. Will it be difficult to wind down these temporary assistance programs given a gradual recovery? I think is an interesting one. Another is, should we be reevaluating the way that governments collect money, say through property taxes don't seem to be as resilient as maybe we thought they once were. So in your mind, maybe those questions, maybe some others, where do you think the big recovery decisions need to happen, and what type of questions are you struggling with right now?
Yeah, I think the answer would be to your two suggestions in terms of looking at how we transit out of these temporary programs into future programs and the issues of reviewing of taxation. I would say yes to both of those. And I think that we kind of crises tend to be create these opportunities for people to look at things. I think certainly right off the top, we're here today having this conversation because of a public health crisis. It is a significant stress test on healthcare systems in Canada and around the world. And you could see cracks in different parts of that, of that system. I think for the most part, we've held up very well in terms of our ability of our public health officials and our hospitals to handle these influxes. But it took, at a major cost in terms of, economic containment. But, definitely you could hear from premiers across the country, things like, long-term care facilities would be an issue that'll come right out of this sort of public health debate, and where we need, and just being ready for the next, epidemic, pandemic. So I think there'll be all kinds of healthcare conversations. I think in terms of your point about how do we transit from these temporary programs to more permanent programs. And I think the government, in order to bring those debt to GDP ratios back down over the medium term, I think the attention, it was just like with the containment, we wanted to flatten the epi curves. These fiscal supports were really just there to ease, to buffer this, the impact of the containment measures. So I think the hope is, from a fiscal person, is that these things are allowed to unwind. And again, these are enormous supports. Going into this crisis, perhaps federal spending was a little over $300 billion. We're adding an additional $150 billion, just in terms of additional measures, supports for households and businesses and sectors. So I think, again, hopefully they do work, in that so we maintain, this attachment between employers and employees. And, for a lot of good folks that have been forced to stay home, that have lost their jobs, that, they could pay rent, students can get through this. But then we allow them to unwind. And so this $250 billion deficit that we're dealing with right now, we start to unwind most of those things. And then the economy starts to grow. We'll get back down to deficits within a couple of years, right where we were going into this. So in the kind of the 1% to 2% range, which is, I think, very sustainable for Canada. But I think there's going to be conversation coming out about, particularly those, the basic income style programs. People, more and more discussions. Do we have the automatic stabilizers built into these fiscal systems to deal with these downturns? So, and I think, in a minority parliament scenario, there'll be a lot of push from the NDP on the Liberal government to look at that sort of discussion. I think, right at the end of these fiscal supports, Mitch, I think we're going to need to talk about fiscal stimulus, because I think the global economy is going to be very sluggish. And the Canadian economy very much so. So I think, public investment programs, training programs, I think, maybe some industry adjustment programs, we'll see that. That'll add to the burden. Yeah, in terms of review of taxation, I think hopefully in the next couple of years, no one's going to be talking about austerity because the economy would be too fragile. But I think, a good time to start reviewing our tax systems. And we know, just to your point, that municipalities are going to be incredibly under a lot of stress to provide their services. We know there's going to be a few provinces that went into this crisis with high debt to GDP. They're going to need help. So fiscal arrangements, I think, are on the table. We're going to need a review.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a bit of a policy buffet, right? The number of things that this pandemic has affected adversely, or in some cases, perhaps positively, depending on you look at it. Say returning a goods producing society to Canada, or making some things here that we haven't made here in a long time. That could be a long term benefit of this, but there really is a huge question of or a lot of questions that need to be answered. And so I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned in your answer there about allowing these programs to unwind. It seems that the immediate response for assistance was help out everybody who needs help. And there really were not a lot of parameters. And when those parameters started causing issues for people, they were commonly loosened by the government to make them more accessible. And I had a thesis advisor once upon a time who used to say something like, I'd rather take the student who missed a few deadlines and then worked hard to catch up rather than the student who always met their deadlines on time, because I knew that the first student could deal with adversity properly. And we haven't really seen the government take that approach yet. So I'm wondering, if this continues to drag on, if there's a second wave, if we're talking about that kind of stuff, despite how difficult it could be politically, are we going to reach a point in your mind where we need to let some of these businesses, companies fail and rein in the parameters by which we give out that kind of assistance?
Yeah, I think politically, I think the government is going to, made like other governments across the world, maybe with one or two exceptions, made the choice that the best way to deal with the transmission of this virus is literally to lock down the economy. And I think so. Governments, I think they've effectively said, we'll take on this sort of moral hazard, and for the time being, we'll keep households flush through various types of programs, strengthening, child benefit programs or old age security programs or EI programs, or develop new programs for part-time workers. And I think for businesses, they, the same thing. They'll provide breaks on wages, on rent, et cetera. So I think, and then liquidity supports in this environment of almost zero net interest, that make sure that the credit markets are flush, and that people, unfortunately, will take on more debt during this period of time. But we don't want them to go under. Like, to your point, where this gets dicey, absolutely, is if we got into a second wave or third wave, and definitely we've seen that. Like, if you go back 100 years, there's people that studied the Spanish influenza, and there were second and third waves there. So that scenario is a darker scenario. And you can't. Can we manage this? The kind of this containment that we saw in March and April and May. Could this go on and on? No, I think there's an end to it. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed. I'm not an epidemiologist, but things start to get a little bit better. We definitely flatten these curves. The numbers of mortalities are quite small right now. So that, I think the government made the right choice. It was a difficult choice in terms of providing these incredible supports. But yeah, they don't want companies to go under. But again, what happens in some sectors that are going to be vulnerable for a long period of time without a vaccine? Transportation sectors would be potentially, some retail, oil and gas, which is hit by another issue of just low commodity prices. Like, is it unlimited in terms of the amount of support? No. So yeah, I think like 2008-9, Mitch, I think you're going to see a big spike in bankruptcies and delinquencies, credit delinquencies, and there's going to be a lot of hardship, and the government can't keep everybody whole. And the longer this goes on, the more disruption and tragedy there will be there. But like, for the time being, like, this is more really a second quarter or part summer issue, and things start to open up slowly. And maybe we don't get to 100% economy until 2022, but keep as much of the economy together as possible.
Yeah, and I think that is a good way to put it. So we're approaching the end of the podcast, the end of our conversation in time. So I do want to ask you about some non-COVID related items, because if we had you on the podcast 3 or 4 months ago, we would have had a lot to talk about anyways. So I do want to pull one of those out, which is just some of the interesting work that you've done at IFSD. And one of the things that I think is really unique is this process of fact-checking the costing of federal political party platforms. And we saw that in the last election. The Parliamentary Budget Office has also started offering a similar service on individual programs. And you even fact-checked some of the Ontario PC or Ontario election platforms in 2018, including one that I was involved with, the People's Guarantee in the 2017-2018 period. So I just thought it was a fantastic idea to kind of raise the level of thought and of discourse that are in our political manifestos. So just tell me, where'd you get the idea to start that, and how effective has that been in your mind in changing the way the political parties do their electioneering?
Yeah, so thank you, Mitch. And yeah, it was an honor to work with you on the People's Platform. Yeah, so we're a small think tank, the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, and yeah, you kind of in this organization, you look to try to be helpful. When I was the Parliamentary Budget Officer a number of years ago, it was development of these legislative budget offices or fiscal councils around the world. And there was some early discussions about could we help Parliament more generally with costing political platforms. And, for the most part, a lot of the legislative budget offices, fiscal councils, quite reticent. There were some exceptions. The big one was Netherlands for me. And I always thought that they found a way, partly because they have this tradition of coalition type governments, minority parliaments in our kind of context, that it allowed their finance department just to generally to help out different political parties. And so, yeah, I was quite supportive of that. So when the Liberals were talking about changing the legislation for the PBO, they reached out to me and they said, do you think it's a good idea? I thought it was a terrific idea. And so I'm glad, and I thought the Parliamentary Budget Office did a great job in terms of costing individual measures. But then there's still a gap, as you know, Mitch, even beyond, once we cost the individual measures, and we did some work with you on the People's Platform. Then there's this broader question of these sort of fiscal credibility assessments. Again, so we want parties to kind of have access to, to costings, but there's still this issue was, are they still within their platforms? Are they being transparent? Are these platforms fiscally sustainable? Are they using kind of realistic, credible assumptions? So there's, these frameworks around fiscal credibility, we thought we could use those frameworks, work with political parties, just help the process. And and I think like you, Mitch, we realized that, we want political leaders in these campaigns to set the priorities, to set the policy directions. And the more we can get a little bit of a jump start on the costing of these measures, then we could be, it would be and the more credibility they could be once they actually become into power, or they're discussing pharmacare big issues, or they're discussing changes to tax systems. Then maybe we're a little bit further down the road. We have a bit more credible numbers to start with. People won't be so shocked when they see these numbers. So that was just one way that we thought we can provide some value added.
Yeah, and just speaking from experience, I thought it was great that was brought to the provincial level, because I think there's been a lot of transparency in recent years, or at least more transparency at the federal level about what parties are looking to spend, and hasn't necessarily spilled over to all the provinces. And I think we're starting to see that level of maturity needed. I will say, speaking from someone who was in opposition when we were writing that platform, it requires a lot of work. The amount of resources that Ontario or federal or other provinces opposition parties have would really be shocking to the average person. And I think that if the bar is going to be raised, we may have to raise the level of resources that they have. But that's a different conversation that I'm sure political friends would get mad at me for having. So listen, as we just conclude here, I just want to say thanks for taking the time to come onto the podcast. I know things are extremely busy, and looking forward to the work that you continue to do at IFSD and through the recovery project. So thanks for coming on the program, Kevin. Thank you, Mitch, and good luck with your work at Intended Consequences. Much appreciated. It's a think tank that we desperately need in Canada. I appreciate that, and thanks, and we'll talk again soon. You bet. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.